An introduction to Return to My Trees. My name is Matthew Yeomans. I'm the founder of Tramping and the author of a book titled Return to My Trees, Notes from the Welsh Woodlands. In this first series of the podcast, I'm going to revisit the 300-mile walking route through Wales that I created when researching the Return to My Trees book. I'll be reading parts of the book and reflecting on the journey I took back in the height of lockdown during the pandemic. Come join me as I tramp my way through Wales. Here's when I first knew I had to write a book about trees. It was a warm Friday afternoon. I'd walked 5 miles through the neighbourhoods of Cardiff in Wales and had reached the sprawling Pentre housing estate on the western fringe of the city. There, bizarrely, I discovered a public footpath that led into a large woodland. I could see the path snaked up to a high ridge, then disappeared in the trees. I had walked many parts of Cardiff, but never seen this wooded route before. I was both exhilarated and a little scared at the prospect of entering this space. It would have been easy to turn back and walk the city streets I knew so well, but I didn't. I stepped through the threshold and into the woods. A few minutes before, I was walking in a busy housing estate. Now, I was alone amongst the trees, hundreds of them standing side by side in a serene coexistence. Clumps of wild garlic grew on the sides of the ridge, and shafts of sunlight bespeckled the ground where I walked. Here, in Pentre Woods, the power of trees and the natural world hit me. The beauty of this peaceful place and its sense of authority overwhelmed me. It seemed to hold a superiority over the messy city life I had left behind. I walked back home that day, almost in a trance, mesmerized by the sense of calm I'd felt in the woods. It was addictive, and I knew I wanted more. When lockdown started in late March 2020, daily life froze, and my family, along with everyone else in the United Kingdom, were forced to stay at home for nearly 3 months, only allowed out to do essential food and medicine shopping, and for one period of exercise each day. We all adapted in our own ways. My wife hunkered down into her hobbies with an application I could only marvel at. First, she went on a crocheting binge. Huge, fluffy packages of wool would arrive by courier to be transformed within hours, or so it felt like, into blankets, sweaters and ponchos. Then she was introduced by a friend to sourdough baking. Before long, we were feasting on sourdough bread, focaccia, pizza, even naan. My 14-year-old daughter coped by binge-watching Netflix and Amazon. Who knew they'd even made 15 series of Grey's Anatomy? My 17-year-old son, meanwhile, did what he always did, playing video games online with friends. Aside from not going to school, his life seemed to carry on pretty much as normal. I didn't take to lockdown as easily. I was the only one of the family who had worked from home before the pandemic hit, but now that I had to stay at home, I was going stir-crazy. Worse still, the bouts of anxiety that I had been fighting for the past few years now came over me daily. I've always relied on exercise and the endorphin buzz of working out to counter my anxious feelings. But when COVID hit, my gym shut and I had to find another option. Outside, the weather was unseasonably warm and dry for early April, so I decided to exercise and practice yoga in the garden. That would be just the peaceful centering activity my body and brain required. But each time I settled onto my purple mat and tried to meditate my anxious thoughts away, noises from the neighbourhood, packed full of other families also confined to their gardens, ate into my brain. I tried playing music through my headphones, but still, I couldn't block out the laughing, barbecuing, and general good-natured cacophony of people trying to make the most out of what was a very bad time. The final straw happened one exceptionally warm afternoon when I was trying to work on my yogic breathing in the garden, only to be soaked by next door's kids dive-bombing into their paddling pool. Outwardly, I laughed about it, but deep down, I felt desperate. There was only one solution. I had to escape. That's when I started walking. Short distances at first around my neighbourhood and the local parks in Cardiff, but then longer, meandering explorations of the city. Wherever I went, whether it be the hidden trails of Bute Park by Cardiff Castle, the tightly packed terraced streets of Cathays and Grangetown, the cycle route down to the bay, or the Taft Trail out to Castelcoch, the magical 19th century Gothic revival folly on the northern edge of the city, the same process would take place. I would start out anxious, but within 10 minutes of setting a steady pace, I would fall into a rhythm of walking, not thinking. As I did, I relaxed, and my breathing and the pounding in my chest that at home was so loud I could hear it as I tried to work, calmed. Soon, I was walking 7 or more miles every day, and I was counting down the hours until I could start out on the next adventure. I wasn't alone. It was remarkable just how many people had committed to walking on a daily basis. The parks were packed, and even the local golf courses, normally reserved for the enjoyment of a privileged few, had been transformed into public spaces by families eager to embrace the outdoors. A national walking culture seemed to have sprung up out of nowhere. Some days I had a plan for where I was headed. Other times I just put one foot in front of the other and went. On my walks, I began to think more about the situation we all found ourselves in. COVID had come at us out of the blue, but the warning signs had been apparent for many years. Having charted the initial panic when the pandemic hit, the media was now turning its attentions to the root causes. Article after article highlighted how the pandemic was a result of a breakdown between nature and society, how decades of deforestation had forced the animal population closer to humans, and how a disease that once might have remained hidden away in deep tropical forests had reached our cities and jumped from animals to humans. Other commentators looked at the havoc this pandemic had caused and warned it was merely a taste of what climate change, caused by a breakdown in the relationship of humans to nature, would bring. Think this pandemic is bad? We have another crisis coming, was the headline of one New York Times column that cried out for a new Green Deal to avert both climate change and future pandemics. Back then, and this feels a little naive looking back in hindsight, it felt like the pandemic, having brought our world to a screeching halt, had shocked people from many walks of life into realizing that the old ways of doing things weren't working anymore. Whether commuting to work each day, burning fossil fuels to power our cars, homes and businesses, or cutting down forests and treating nature like an afterthought just to satisfy our rampant consumer culture. The virus had exposed our greatest fallibilities, but at the same time, the vacuum of normal activity it had created was giving us the headspace to contemplate how we could live life better in the future. Once I'd come down from the initial euphoria of my brief escape into nature, I started researching the importance of trees to our future well-being. I read about how trees in one form or another have been nurturing the atmosphere of our planet for nearly 400 million years. Even our earliest ancestors only date back some 2 million years. And ever since the majority of humans stopped hunting and gathering and began to form settled communities, they'd cut down trees at an incredible rate. 2,000 years ago, the Earth was covered with more than 6 trillion trees. Today, just 3 trillion remain. At the current rate of deforestation, the world's great rainforests will likely disappear within 100 years. I took in a raft of new reports published in the wake of the pandemic that raised the alarm about our long neglect of the forest and how it imperils our own survival. I read about how deforestation in the Amazon was surging even during the pandemic, and how the wetland rainforests of the Pantanal on the border of Brazil and Paraguay were on fire for the first time in living memory. Wildfires were consuming truly ancient sequoias and redwoods in Northern California, and, just a few months before, Australia's wildfires had destroyed entire species and ecosystems. I learned about global governmental pledges to plant millions of trees to combat climate change and mitigate the impact of destroying forests in the first place, and how some of these pledges had caused more environmental problems than they had solved. I looked at the issue from a business point of view, how companies were starting to evaluate natural capital, the term used in sustainability and accounting terms to describe the financial cost or value of a company's interactions with nature. And I tried to get my head around new initiatives to provide forests and nature in general with the same level of legal protection afforded humans and companies. I learned about Earth Overshoot Day, the date when humanity's demand for ecological resources and services in any given year exceeds what Earth can regenerate in that year. I discovered that in 2020 we would reach that mark on August the 20th. When my head hurt from all the economic, policy, technological, environmental, and legal discussions, I lost myself in legends, myths, and folklore associated with forests, the mystical relationship that humans have with trees, and why they so enchant and fascinate us. Surely, if we could discover the importance of our relationship with trees and nature, then we could move towards a way of life that restored the balance we desperately needed. I became convinced that I needed to throw myself into exploring how rebalancing our broken relationship with nature could provide us with a sustainable way forward. But I felt I lacked the authority to make this my project. After all, there were plenty of arborists, climate change experts, dendrologists, environmentalists, economists, and cultural commentators who already knew far more about this topic than me. Maybe, though, by pulling all these strands together, I could provide the big picture view of why our world had to change. What I needed was a hook, an approach I could make my own. One morning, while going through news stories related to forests, I found it. Just a few weeks before, the Welsh Government had announced plans to build a national forest for Wales. The idea was to create a pathway of biodiversity through the country by linking existing woodlands and planting new trees along the way. Not only would the forest support different ecosystems, it would also help combat the climate emergency and provide spaces for leisure activities, including walking and biking. The statement was suitably vague. The government would spend the next year consulting with local communities to determine the exact route and makeup of the national forest. But the intent was clear. The multi-decade project placed trees and forests at the very heart of a sustainable vision for Wales, building on the nation's already impressive credentials as the first country to enact a Well-being of Future Generations Act. The Act put the sustainable development of the economy and community at the heart of policymaking. Crucially, it required all public bodies to account for their impact on future generations who will have to live with the consequences, asking them to consider decisions not just from an economic growth point of view, but also in terms of their impact on the environment and nature, and on the social well-being and health of communities. The idea of a national forest winding its way through Wales was very exciting. What might it look like? Where would it go? How would it get funded? What were the politics involved? Were there legal considerations? Would everyone buy into the idea? Most of all, what could it teach us about how we live in harmony with nature and how our lives could be improved? The potential lessons weren't just relevant to the people of Wales. These were universal considerations. However, Wales presented the perfect prototype for building this new relationship between people and nature. Not only did it have sustainable development woven into law, but it was small, yet connected enough to build a nature-based culture and economy that could provide a scalable blueprint for the rest of the world. And then it dawned on me, what if I mapped out a route for this proposed national forest for Wales and explored it on foot? First off, it sounded great fun, would get me out of the house, and could be a calming tonic for those anxious thoughts I have. At the same time, by walking through Wales, perhaps I could start to find answers to that crucial question. How can we make peace and restore balance with nature?
You've been listening to Return to My Trees, a tramping podcast. It was narrated by Matthew Yeomans and edited by Dullan Yeomans. The musical interludes are by the folk duo Filkin's Drift. Join us for the next episode, where we delve even deeper into the woodlands of Wales.